They gave me 72 hours to tear down the home I built by hand. 72 hours to erase years of work, creativity, and stubbornness. I didn't build that cabin because I needed a place to stay. I built it because I wanted to prove something, to myself more than anyone else, that I could create something meaningful, something absurd, something entirely mine. Bottle walls, mismatched timbers salvaged from old barns, a functioning drawbridge built from rusted car parts. It was a living sculpture as much as a house. A middle finger to the bland, plastic world of manicured lawns and perfectly symmetrical window shutters. And I did it all on my own lot, a little acre left behind from an old family property. It should have been nobody's business. But then came the letter. Typed, official, full of legal words like unsanctioned, non-compliant, and hazardous to neighborhood values. They didn't even knock on my door first. They just taped it to my fence like a notice of eviction in some cheap drama series. The HOA wasn't just a homeowners association here. It was practically a paramilitary organization. The suburbs around me were ruled by garden parties held like strategy briefings, bake sales planned like war campaigns. Betty Carson was the general, always had been. Blonde highlights too perfect for someone pushing 60, posture like a Marine drill instructor. If you left your garbage bins out 15 minutes too long, she knew. If your grass hit a scandalous 2 inches above regulation, she was on your doorstep with a clipboard before you could find your flip-flop. She hated my cabin the way some people hate graffiti on old churches. To her, it was vandalism on the suburban dream she curated like an antique doll collection. I didn't fit her world. I was the wild rust spot on her chrome. They said it was about property values. They said it was about safety. I could see through that like clean glass. It was about conformity. About control. About making sure every roof shingle was identical, every mailbox painted in precisely the right shade of muted colonial green. Anything different was dangerous, and I had dared to build something different right in their backyard. They gave me 72 hours, starting at noon that day. I read that letter under the shadow of my own creation, feeling like a king whose castle was under siege. I could have taken it down. I could have packed it up, sold the scrap for pennies, apologized, shaved off the parts of me that didn't fit into their pretty little blueprint of suburban mediocrity. But I didn't build that place to fit in. I built it because I didn't fit anywhere else. It wasn't like I hadn't tried their world once. Long before that letter, I'd worked the kind of job that comes with ties and deadlines, commuted with people who all wore the same tired face like they all forgot what it felt like to laugh, paid taxes, nodded politely at PTA meetings, got birthday cards from HR. The whole glossy package. And it drained me dry. That cabin was rebellion and refuge. The bottles in the walls weren't just pretty, they were from every moment I wanted to remember. The amber ones were from the night I finally walked away from my corporate job. The green ones were from my grandfather's old soda collection, the same grandfather who taught me how to hold a hammer before I learned to write cursive. The mismatched timbers weren't just scavenged wood. They were remnants of old barns torn down before another fast food chain paved over history. Every piece of that structure told a story. And now a stack of copy paper bureaucracy wanted to call it trash. I stood there with that letter in one hand and a screwdriver in the other, chest hollow with frustration. My phone buzzed twice, neighbors gossiping already. They loved to watch from a safe distance, peeking from behind curtains, pretending sympathy while itching for drama. HOA drama was suburban blood sport. They'd have bets on whether I'd fight or fold before sundown. But here's the thing about a man who builds his house with his own 2 hands out of nothing but junk and grit. Folding isn't in the blueprint. I didn't need their approval. I needed a reason. And Betty just gave me one. Betty probably thought I'd cave, because that's what most people did. They got the warning, got embarrassed, got compliant. Fall in line. Mow the lawn. Paint the shutters. Join the club. Smile for the block party pictures and pretend the cookies weren't flavorless dust. She didn't know that this wasn't a garden shed project for me. This was the last piece of defiance I still had in me. What burned worse wasn't just the threat of demolition, it was the laughter. Not the out-loud kind, but the type that lingers behind condescending emails and forced neighborly smiles. The kind that said, "We knew you wouldn't last. You're not one of us." Like building something weird and colorful was an act of shame. Like creativity was contagious, and they couldn't have that virus spreading across their neat little street. They used words like community while pushing people out of it, and I wasn't going to be one more name on their victory list. I folded that letter carefully and slid it into my tool belt, right next to the wrench I used to crank up the drawbridge. That ridiculous, heavy, squeaky contraption made from reclaimed gears and fence posts. Probably the thing they hated most. I gave the crank a hard twist, and the bridge lifted slowly, groaning like some ancient monster waking from a nap. Let them stare. Let them call it dangerous. I built this fortress for a reason. And now, with that notice in my pocket, I knew exactly why. I wasn't going anywhere. They wanted a demolition? Fine. But it wasn't going to be my home that came down first. It was going to be the lie they called community. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up tracing property lines, not with a ruler but with memory. My grandfather used to tell me, when someone's trying to push you off your own land, the first thing you do is learn it better than they do. I sat with old survey maps, records the county forgot, dusty boxes filled with deeds and plats from a time before HOAs were even a concept. That's when I found it. Buried in legal ink and antique handwriting, a clause, a loophole, a mistake made decades ago by some overeager real estate clerk. The HOA was built on 2 parcels of land, not 1. And my acre? It wasn't just outside their authority. Technically, they'd been using part of my lot as access to their community park. Unwitting trespassers for years. The walkway that led from their manicured streets to the playground their kids used, the picnic benches where they staged their bake sales, the shed where they kept their gardening tools. It was all on a legal sliver of my property. Somehow, in their obsession with enforcing uniformity, they'd forgotten to enforce their own boundaries. I sat there, silent, staring at the paperwork like I'd found buried treasure. This wasn't revenge. This was mathematics. They wanted to play with laws? I'd speak their language. My home might be non-compliant in their eyes, but their entire community park was now my unpaid rental space. At dawn, I walked down that ridiculous cobblestone path they'd laid, watching the sun cast perfect symmetrical shadows over their sterile flower bed. The flag was already flying on Betty's porch, of course. Everything in her world was predictable except me. I wasn't supposed to have cards left to play. Betty greeted me with that suburban smile, the one practiced between Pilates classes and HOA planning sessions. "We'll need you to comply quickly," she said, already rehearsing what came next. Fines. Legal escalation. Probably threats of liens. She was used to scaring people into obedience. I didn't say a word. I just handed her a crisp copy of the land records I'd highlighted, with every square foot neatly marked. Her expression faltered, like a porcelain plate with a hidden crack. This can't be right," she stammered. "It's been right since 1947, I answered. "You've been using my land for your park." That was the first time I saw something new in Betty's face, uncertainty. Not anger. Not arrogance. Just confusion, like a general realizing their map was upside down. "Don't worry," I said. "I'm reasonable. I'm willing to let you continue using it. But starting today, you owe me rent." She laughed, but it wasn't that confident, commanding laugh anymore. It was brittle. "You can't charge us rent. This is a community." "No," I corrected her. "This is a business now." It wasn't about greed. It wasn't about punishing them for daring to be suburban. It was about respect. I built that house out of scraps. They tried to reduce it to garbage. If they wanted to play by rules, I would write better ones. Word spread through the HOA like gasoline under a match. Suddenly, all those clipped, pleasant neighbors were meeting in emergency groups on trimmed lawns, whispering furiously behind tinted sunglasses. I became the villain in their perfectly curated world. They called it extortion. They called it betrayal. They never once called it what it really was: fair. They'd taken it for granted that they owned everything they touched. They built community spaces on foundations of assumption, not ownership. And now they were scrambling because someone didn't roll over at the first bark of authority. Betty tried everything to intimidate me. Legal threats, phone calls from city officials, friends of friends, anonymous notes on my porch telling me to leave while you still can. But I didn't build that house because I scare easy. You don't build a drawbridge if you're planning on running. Then came the escalation. I half expected it, but not the level of pettiness they brought. Bake sales transformed into fundraisers, not for cookies but to hire lawyers. The HOA budget, usually reserved for ornamental lamp posts and sidewalk maintenance, suddenly found itself diverted toward litigation strategy. Meanwhile, neighbors I barely knew glared at me from behind garden hedges like I'd spray-painted profanity on their white picket dreams. What none of them expected was that I'd done my homework better than their attorneys. I wasn't just some guy with rusty nails and chicken coops on the roof. I was raised by people who survived worse than HOA fines. I knew zoning laws better than half the people sitting in their committee chairs. And I wasn't afraid of being hated. I'd been disliked before for far less interesting reasons. Still, it wasn't easy. You don't stare down an entire neighborhood without feeling that weight creep into your bones. I'd spent so long thinking the world outside didn't care what I built as long as I wasn't hurting anyone. Turns out, doing something different was enough of a threat to make otherwise friendly people turn feral. I didn't enjoy watching them scramble, not really. There was no pleasure in seeing families stressed out over bake sales that suddenly weren't about cookies but about saving face. Kids who just wanted to use swings and slides now had parents hissing about legal action behind them. The whole thing stank of absurdity. But I wasn't going to be made small so someone else could feel big. Not again. The local newspaper caught wind of it next. Of course they did. Small towns thrive on scandal, and this was better than a church picnic gone wrong. Homeowner battles, HOA over land rights, community in uproar. They made it sound like I was staging a coup. I half expected someone to Photoshop a picture of me wearing a crown on that ridiculous drawbridge. But underneath the drama was something else, something sharper than just legal fights or bake sales. There was a lesson bleeding out from every headline and whispered rumor. When you build a system on assumptions and control, it only takes one person standing their ground to make the whole thing look foolish. They tried using shame, but I'd already given up on needing their approval years ago. They tried using law, but I had law in my back pocket. And when all that failed, they tried pity, suddenly playing the community card like it hadn't been a weapon used against me from the start. Betty came one last time, this time without the army of clipboards behind her. Just her, standing on that path like a monarch in exile. "Is there any way we can settle this?" she asked. The sharpness was gone from her voice, replaced by exhaustion. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just nodded. "Start by recognizing that your version of community doesn't include everyone. And if you want it to, you don't get to decide who fits." It wasn't revenge. It was education. And it was overdue. It didn't take long for the HOA to shift tactics again. When they realized legal intimidation wasn't going to work, they pivoted to social warfare. Suddenly, the neighborhood group chat was full of exaggerated stories about me. Claims that I was dangerous. Rumors that my chicken coop spread disease, that I was a hoarder, that my cabin was a fire hazard, even that I was a threat to children. Lies, transparent, brittle lies, but enough to poison a polite, HOA-controlled neighborhood already hungry for a villain. They painted me as the outsider, the menace at the edge of their pristine world, because that was easier than admitting the truth, that I'd simply beat them at their own game. I expected the whisper campaigns, the fake concern in their voices when they spoke about the safety of the children. What I didn't expect were the people who quietly started siding with me. It began with one of the landscapers they hired to maintain the uniformity of their gardens. Mid-30s, hard-working, brown-skinned, polite, but treated like furniture by the HOA board. He started showing up early for his work days, parking his truck a little closer to my fence, offering nods of solidarity. Then came the older man who worked nights at the hardware store, who slipped me building supplies with a subtle grin. People who knew what it felt like to be treated as less than by suburban royalty, people who'd been on the receiving end of HOA prejudice long before I ever drew attention to myself. One day, the mail carrier dropped a small note in my mailbox with no return address. It simply said, "Good." They needed to be knocked down a peg. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about a pattern that ran through the whole community. People who didn't dress the way they were expected to. Families who spoke languages Betty didn't understand. Renters treated like squatters, service workers ignored unless they were being ordered around. The HOA wasn't just enforcing neighborhood standards, it was enforcing a social order, one where people like me were supposed to stay quiet, compliant, invisible. I wasn't interested in being invisible. So I did what they didn't expect. I opened my ridiculous, patched-together cabin to the very people they'd ignored. Sunday afternoons turned into strange little gatherings. Kids from working-class families coming to see my bottle walls, curious about how a door could double as a drawbridge. Adults who normally kept their heads down in HOA meetings now stopping by to share coffee, talk property law, or just breathe without judgment. The HOA, of course, lost their collective minds. They called it unsanctioned gatherings. They accused me of disturbing the peace. One of them had the audacity to suggest I was forming a cult. But they didn't understand what was actually happening. It wasn't rebellion. It was relief. People were sick of being told how to live by people who never learned how to listen. What I built was more than a cabin. It was an escape hatch from performative suburban perfection. And the more they tried to shame me, the more people started asking questions. Not about me, but about them. Why was the HOA budget constantly being rerouted into legal fees when sidewalks were cracked and playgrounds rusty? Why were families with accents or older vehicles always the ones getting fines for property appearance violations? Why did the HOA talk about community values, but never show up when someone's basement flooded or their car broke down? Betty's grip on her little empire was starting to slip. You could see it in her eyes at the next HOA meeting, which, thanks to rising neighborhood interest, had to be moved to the local community center just to fit everyone. She tried to hold court the way she always did, standing tall, using that PTA president tone like she was addressing unruly middle schoolers. But the room didn't belong to her anymore. And that's when I decided to escalate, but not the way they expected. Not with more threats, not with higher rent, but with exposure. I made copies of every HOA budget from the last 5 years. Every record of fines issued. I highlighted every inconsistency. I compiled testimonies from neighbors who'd been targeted for arbitrary infractions. Missing fence boards, holiday decorations left up too long, kids playing too loudly. I didn't deliver it to the HOA. I gave it to the local news reporter who'd first covered my battle with the HOA. They thought that first article was a scandal. They hadn't seen anything yet. Within days, the real story hit the town. Not just the quirky guy fighting for his land, but the systematic prejudice hidden behind HOA regulations. People started sharing their own stories. Families who'd been fined relentlessly after the death of a spouse, elderly residents pushed toward selling their homes because they couldn't keep up with maintenance, renters threatened with eviction for things like having garden gnomes. Betty's veneer of control shattered. The real beauty of the whole thing wasn't revenge or power. It was transformation. The neighborhood had been living under quiet tyranny, wearing matching smiles while carrying unspoken resentments. Now the conversations shifted. Instead of whispering about me, they started whispering about change. about elections, about new leadership. I didn't want control of the HOA. I didn't want to be the next petty tyrant. What I wanted was accountability. And now it was happening. People who'd sat silent for years stood up at meetings. Longtime residents who'd been treated like second-class citizens started demanding audit. Cultural shift doesn't start with big speeches. It starts when regular people realize they're allowed to stop apologizing for existing. That ridiculous cabin of mine, the one with the bottle walls, the rooftop chicken coop, the over-engineered drawbridge, it became a symbol of something bigger than defiance. It was proof that you didn't have to fit into someone else's mold to deserve respect. And as for Betty, the woman who used to knock on my door with threats now crossed the street when she saw me, not because I intimidated her, but because she couldn't face what I'd revealed. That her leadership wasn't leadership at all, it was control dressed up as civic responsibility. And that illusion was broken now, not just by me, but by the very people she used to ignore. The cabin stayed standing. The rent stayed active. But more importantly, something else stood taller than my chicken coops or my ridiculous drawbridge. A neighborhood learning, finally, how to belong to itself. That local news report was only the beginning. Once the HOA's dirty laundry went public, it didn't stay contained to the neighborhood. The local station's story started picking up traction online, shared by advocacy groups who'd long fought against HOA abuses across the country. Turns out, my ridiculous little cabin war had tapped into something far larger than a suburban squabble. It had become a symbol of fighting back against petty, discriminatory bureaucracy everywhere. The phrase, HOA tyrants, started trending in comments. People from other neighborhoods sent their own horror stories about HOAs fining veterans for flying the American flag too high, or harassing elderly widows for chipped paint. Suddenly, I was getting emails from people with law degrees offering help pro bono. Not because I asked, but because they hated what HOAs had become. A system designed to make neighborhoods prettier on the outside while slowly suffocating anyone who didn't conform on the inside. That was never what neighborhood associations were supposed to be, and people were waking up to that fact in real time. I didn't need more money. I didn't need attention. But what I saw now was an opportunity to turn this absurd little fight into something that actually mattered. I created an online fund, not for myself, but for anyone in my area fighting unfair HOA actions. Any resident fined for nonsense, any family harassed for living their life peacefully, any elderly neighbor who couldn't navigate the legal jargon being thrown at them by neighborhood leaders. Within 48 hours, the fund had over $50,000 in small donations. That was the crack that broke the dam. The HOA board's internal chats, which used to be smug, started to sound desperate. I knew this because one of their own leaked the transcripts to me anonymously. Betty and her inner circle were terrified, not because of me, but because of the exposure. They had controlled the narrative for so long that they didn't know how to function when the narrative turned against them. Meanwhile, neighbors who never spoke up before were showing up to HOA meetings with actual legal representation. One woman, a single mother who worked 2 jobs, brought in a civil rights lawyer who started asking detailed questions about discrimination patterns in fine issuance. Another elderly couple presented evidence that their code violations were fabricated by a board member who wanted to force them to sell at a discount for a friend's real estate scheme. The air of HOA authority that once dominated the room dissolved into nervous glances and unfinished sentences. The craziest part? I didn't have to do much more. The community was now moving on its own, like a ship realizing it's not anchored anymore. Even residents who once believed in the HOA's mission were starting to feel betrayed, like they'd been lied to about what their fees were actually paying for. And through it all, my absurd cabin just stood there, chickens clucking on the roof, absurd bottles shimmering in the sun, that drawbridge creaking like the world's dumbest medieval fortress. What was once an eyesore to the HOA had become a gathering spot, not because people loved how it looked, but because it represented standing up when you're told to sit down. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was dignity reclaimed. One of the most powerful moments came when a neighbor, a quiet man in his late 60s who I'd barely spoken to before, came by to shake my hand. He didn't say much, just looked at the ridiculous cabin and said, "It's not about the house, is it?" I just nodded. He got it. And once you see the game being played, you don't unsee it. But here's where things got really interesting. A couple of HOA board members tried to salvage their reputations by flipping side. They started showing up at my gatherings pretending they'd always had concerns about Betty's leadership, that they were victims too. I wasn't angry about it. Honestly, I found it hilarious. Cowards rarely know how to act when the wind changes direction. Betty wasn't backing down without a fight. That woman was too deep in her own illusion of control. She hired a lawyer, and they tried to file an injunction against me personally, accusing me of inciting unrest, claiming that I was responsible for emotional distress suffered by the HOA board. The paperwork was so sloppy it was almost comedic. Apparently, somewhere in her world of casseroles and flower arrangements, Betty had decided I was the villain in a suburban soap opera of her own making. But while she was busy playing house court drama, something bigger was happening outside of her view. The city council caught wind of the story. And city councils love two things: avoiding scandal and controlling their optic. They started looking into not just my HOA, but HOA practices citywide. Public hearings were called. Advocacy groups showed up. Lawyers who'd once handled discrimination cases on national scales now had their attention fixed firmly on my town. The day that Betty tried to present her injunction in front of a judge, it got dismissed in less than 5 minutes. Turns out, you can't claim emotional distress from exposure of your own wrongdoing. And that was when Betty finally realized she'd lost. Not just the battle over my ridiculous cabin, but the illusion of absolute authority she'd wielded for years over everyone who lived under her thumb. But here's the best part. This didn't end with Betty humiliated or me celebrating like I'd won a game. It ended with real change. By the next HOA election cycle, almost the entire board was replaced. Not by me, but by the people they'd been ignoring and exploiting for years. And those people? They didn't want power. They wanted fairness. They didn't want to micromanage people's gardens. They wanted to make sure elderly residents didn't slip on broken sidewalks. They didn't want to fine people over mailbox colors. They wanted to build better community spaces, help neighbors with repairs, create programs for kids whose parents worked long shifts. It wasn't revenge. It was growth. It was inclusion. And I didn't lead it. I just lit the match under the whole soggy pile of hypocrisy they'd been stacking for years. As for me, I didn't run for any positions. I kept my ridiculous cabin. I kept my chickens. And when people asked me why I never tore it down even after I'd technically won, I told them the truth. It wasn't about winning. It was about reminding every single person who felt small that sometimes you don't have to play by the rules if the rules were rigged from the start. The funniest part of all? After all the outrage, after all the battles, after all the lawsuits, one of the new HOA board members actually came by one day, looked at my absurd cabin with the drawbridge and the mismatched paint and said, "You know, it's kind of cool. It only took a neighborhood war to get there. But we got there. Together." It was strange how quickly the chaos settled into something resembling community again. The same people who once avoided eye contact with each other at the mailbox were now having real conversations. Not polite suburban greetings. The real kind, where people admit they're struggling with bills or talk openly about why they stayed quiet for so long. What started as a battle over an absurd cabin turned into something no one had seen coming: honesty. Vulnerability, even. I watched neighbors who used to glare at each other over hedges now pooling money to help an elderly couple fix their porch. The HOA meetings no longer felt like courtrooms. They felt like brainstorming sessions for people who actually cared about where they lived. One of the most powerful shifts was watching people start advocating for each other, not just themselves. I saw a man who'd barely spoken up during the HOA chaos show up to speak for his neighbor, an immigrant family who'd been fined multiple times for trivial violations that were clearly just coded discrimination. This wasn't just fighting for lawns anymore, it was fighting for dignity, for fairness, for a neighborhood that reflected everyone, not just the loudest voices with the fanciest garden gnomes. The redemption part wasn't just external. I'm not going to lie, when I started this whole thing, I was angry. Not just annoyed, deep, bitter, humiliated kind of angry. It's easy to get lost in that, to make your whole personality revolve around proving people wrong. But somewhere along the line, I realized that if I didn't shift that energy, I was going to become the exact thing I hated, a control freak obsessed with winning for the sake of it. That wasn't leadership. That was just revenge dressed up like activism. I didn't want to burn the neighborhood down. I wanted to stop it from rotting under fake smiles and passive-aggressive note. That's why I started stepping back. I gave the new HOA board my full support, but I didn't want a seat at the table. It wasn't my table. My fight had been personal, but the real change needed to be collective. Leadership wasn't about me getting more control. It was about making sure no one else got crushed by people who thought they deserved it more. I watched with genuine pride as people who'd never spoken in public before stood up and laid out plans for neighborhood repairs, for community programs, for making sure nobody felt trapped by nonsense bylaws again. And the real heroes? It wasn't me. It was the single mom who went toe-to-toe with the old leadership in meetings, not for herself, but because she refused to let her kids grow up thinking that's how power should work. It was the elderly veteran who quietly donated to legal fees behind the scenes without ever wanting credit. It was the immigrant family that, after being targeted for fines, turned around and invited the whole block over for food, bridging gaps that years of HOA newsletters never could. That's heroism. Not loud, not flashy, just steady, undeniable courage in everyday life. One of the things that stuck with me was how this entire mess exposed the difference between rules and values. HOAs had been obsessed with rules. The exact height of grass, the specific color of shutters, the precise location of trash bins. But none of those things meant anything without actual values. Fairness, respect, empathy. You can build 1,000 perfect neighborhoods on paper, but without those values underneath, all you've got is a prettier version of prison. And that's why the cultural shift happened. People realized they didn't have to accept cruelty disguised as order. They didn't have to keep swallowing nonsense just because someone in a blazer told them to. Inclusion wasn't just about race or class. It was about including the weirdos like me, the outliers, the ones who build cabins with chicken coops on the roof and think drawbridges are funny. It was about making space for the quiet neighbors, the struggling families, the kids riding bikes with mismatched tires. It wasn't just rebellion, it was redefinition. Growth came in strange forms. That same quirky recluse with the chickens, me, found himself having conversations about zoning ordinances with people who once thought I was just a neighborhood nuisance. People who used to mock my DIY projects were asking how to build garden beds that could help elderly neighbors grow vegetables more easily. We went from lawn wars to community gardens in under 6 months. It was like watching a dilapidated house get gutted and remodeled from the foundation up, not for profit but for life. There were still rough patches. Not everyone bought into the change overnight. Some of the old guard tried to stir up resentment, whisper campaigns about ruining tradition or lowering property values. But their voices didn't carry the same weight anymore. The silent majority wasn't silent anymore. They saw the game, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Even those hesitant about the new leadership were willing to give it a chance, because what came before had been exposed for what it really was, a control system dressed in community language. Forgiveness played a strange role here. I didn't hate Betty, even after everything. At some point, it became clear that she wasn't just power-hungry, she was afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of losing control, afraid that if the world didn't fit neatly into her perfectly trimmed hedges, it would mean something was wrong with her. That didn't excuse what she did, but it made her actions understandable. And when people act from fear, they don't need revenge. They need boundaries. Firm ones, with compassion on the other side, if they're willing to reach for it. I never spoke to her again after the injunction failed. Not out of spite, but because I didn't need anything from her anymore. The community handled itself. Redemption wasn't about dragging people back into courtrooms, it was about giving people the space to grow if they wanted it, and moving forward if they didn't. Betty faded into the background, replaced by people who were more interested in planting flowers than policing fences. The legacy of all this wasn't my ridiculous cabin. It was the shift in how people treated each other afterward. Kids playing outside without their parents worrying about HOA fines over chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Neighbors helping each other without being told to. And yes, the occasional barbecue hosted next to the world's dumbest drawbridge, because sometimes life is better when it's just a little bit weird. What surprised me the most wasn't that we won. It was that winning didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like a beginning. Not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, follow the rules because that's just how it is. Turns out, how it is can be rewritten. And not by politicians or celebrities or HOA tyrants, but by the people living on the street, sharing borrowed tools, mismatched chairs, and homemade casseroles that don't need approval from anyone in a blazer. Transformation wasn't in the headlines or the court documents, it was in the way people looked each other in the eye afterward. With respect, with real inclusion, and finally with trust. The strangest thing about building something new isn't the moment you win, it's the moment you realize you don't actually need to win to change everything. By the time the legal mess was finally over, most of the community had already shifted, like soil turning after a storm. People weren't waiting for permission anymore. They were acting. They were speaking up. They were learning that fighting back wasn't always about lawsuits or speeches. It was about standing next to your neighbor and saying, "We're not going to let this happen anymore." And once that started, it didn't stop. I watched the leadership transform in real time. The new HOA wasn't made up of power-hungry people desperate for control. It was made of folks who'd never even imagined themselves in positions of authority before. A retired teacher. A grocery store manager. A dad with 3 jobs who showed up exhausted to every meeting but never missed one. This wasn't polished leadership with prepared talking points. It was messy, vulnerable, and raw. And it was honest in a way suburban politics almost never are. And it worked. Not perfectly, not neatly, but authentically. We didn't just fix the zoning issues. We rewrote the bylaws from scratch. Gone were the absurd fines for ridiculous violations like mismatched mailbox colors or having too many potted plants on your porch. Instead, we focused on actual safety. Sidewalk repairs, making sure drainage systems worked properly, cutting through red tape so elderly residents didn't have to jump through hoops to get accessibility ramps installed. What had once been a system of punishment had been flipped into a tool of support. And that was when something strange happened. I started getting letters. Not official ones. Handwritten ones. From people in other neighborhoods, from other cities, who'd heard about what we'd done here. Some had been crushed by their own HOAs, paying fines they couldn't afford over paint chips or fence slats being an inch too high. Others were landlords trying to navigate impossible demands from suburban committees that seemed more interested in control than care. They wanted to know how we'd done it. Not just the legal tricks, but the human part. How do you change people's minds when they're used to following ridiculous rules for the sake of order? That's when I realized that the real legacy of what we'd started wasn't just in this one neighborhood. It was in the ripple effect. People were hungry. Not for chaos, not for revenge, but for community that actually meant something. Not the kind that gets printed on neighborhood newsletters next to mandatory bake sale dates, but the kind that shows up when your car breaks down or when you're a single parent drowning in life's details. They wanted help. They wanted inclusion. They wanted a break from a world that seemed increasingly obsessed with perfection and control. What started as a ridiculous zoning war over my strange little chicken coop cabin had become a lesson in advocacy. Not just fighting for your right to be weird or different, but fighting for your neighbor's right to be safe, to be heard, to be free from arbitrary nonsense that only benefits the people at the top of the rule pyramid. Advocacy wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't easy, but it was contagious. Once one person did it, others followed. It was like watching dry kindling finally catch fire, not destructive fire, but warming fire. The kind that makes people gather around instead of scattering. And it wasn't just about stopping bad things. It was about building good things. Programs started popping up. Tool-sharing libraries where people could borrow power drills or lawnmowers instead of everyone having to buy their own. Volunteer days where the entire block pitched in to repair someone's crumbling stairs. Even mentorship programs, where older residents with trade skills taught younger ones how to handle repairs, build things, or start their own small businesses. It wasn't charity, it was investment. In each other. Watching this transformation felt like standing at the edge of something bigger than any one person. You realize fast that power doesn't always come from institutions or bank accounts. Sometimes it just comes from people deciding that enough is enough. That they're not going to nod politely anymore when someone tells them their kids' chalk drawings are lowering property values. That they're not going to swallow discrimination disguised as standards anymore. That they're not going to let small people with small hearts dictate the terms of everyone's lives. It was inspiring, but it was also humbling. I didn't make this happen alone. I started it, sure, but leadership wasn't about standing on a pedestal. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder with people who'd never been invited to lead before. That's where the strength came from. Not from winning arguments, but from turning arguments into action. Turning frustration into foundation. Turning anger into growth. And the people who benefited most weren't just the loud ones. It was the quiet ones. The ones who'd lived here for years feeling like guests in their own homes. The elderly man who always waved but never spoke, now helping plan accessible sidewalk. The shy teenager who volunteered to build garden beds for the single moms. People who'd been invisible because the system didn't make space for them suddenly became indispensable, not because someone gave them permission, but because they realized no one could stop them. The prejudice that had simmered under the surface wasn't gone, but it was exposed. And exposure is how you beat that kind of poison, not by pretending it's not there, but by dragging it into the light where it can't survive. No more polite silence while absurd fines got handed out based on who someone was rather than what they'd done. No more meetings full of condescension and coded language about keeping up appearances. People spoke plainly now. And if they didn't know the right words, they asked. Empathy started growing like wildflowers between the cracks of all the old, broken systems. What surprised me most wasn't just the victory. It was how forgiveness played a role even with people who didn't deserve it. Not forgiveness for the sake of forgetting, but forgiveness for the sake of moving forward. Carrying bitterness is exhausting. Carrying purpose is energizing. And you can't build anything new if your hands are full of old grudges. That was one of the biggest lessons I learned through all of this. The people who thrived weren't the ones holding on to the past. They were the ones carrying bricks to help build the future. Leadership didn't mean standing above anyone. It meant lifting people up with you. And the real cultural shift wasn't just about bylaws or zoning. It was about realizing that communities could be more than property lines and tax records. They could be networks of care, of support, of shared weirdness and imperfection. They could be families. Not because of blood, but because of choice. That's what we chose. That's what we built. And it didn't come from perfection. It came from resilience. From stubbornness in the face of absurdity. From refusing to let people turn neighborhoods into little empires of control. It came from looking at the stupidest HOA war anyone had ever seen and saying, "We're going to make something good come out of this anyway." And we did. In the aftermath of everything that had happened, something unexpected took hold, not just in the neighborhood but in me. What started as defiance became something else entirely: responsibility. Not the forced kind that's dumped on your shoulders by accident, but the chosen kind, the kind you carry because you know if you don't, nobody else will. And as wild as it sounded coming from a guy who built a ridiculous chicken coop drawbridge house, I realized I wasn't just the troublemaker anymore. I was the one people were looking at to figure out what came next. With all the nonsense of zoning loopholes, legal threats, and neighborhood feuds, I didn't expect to be anyone's role model. I didn't even like the term. But the letters I got, the people who stopped me when I was out for a walk, they weren't asking for permission. They were asking for guidance. And not just about property rights or bylaws. They were asking how to stand up for themselves without turning into bitter versions of the people they were fighting against. They wanted to know how to fight without losing themselves in the process. That's where mentorship began, not by choice but by necessity. I started holding small meetings. Not HOA meetings, but informal gatherings where people could come, sit in a folding chair, have a coffee, and talk about what they wanted their neighborhoods to become. These weren't polished leadership seminars. They were raw, clumsy, and honest. And they worked. People weren't used to being listened to by someone who wasn't trying to sell them something. And once you give someone that kind of space, it changes them. I watched teenagers who'd never said a word at community events start sketching ideas for local parks. I watched moms who'd been dismissed as just volunteers step into organizing roles that made bake sales look like professional fundraising operations. I saw people who'd been living under the weight of discrimination for years finally speak up, not just to complain but to build, to offer solutions, to demand better, not just for themselves but for everyone else too. Growth was everywhere. And not the easy, Instagram-filtered kind, the sweaty, frustrating, brilliant kind that only happens when people decide they're worth more than what they've been told. And as that mentorship spread, something else started happening. The old guard couldn't keep up. They tried, of course, the usual tactics: fear, threats, warnings about what happens to neighborhoods that don't follow the rules. But fear doesn't work once people know they're standing together. Fear thrives in isolation. Break that isolation, and the whole system starts shaking at its foundation. And that's exactly what we did. Together. One by one, the people who used to treat the HOA like a personal fiefdom started stepping down, not because we forced them out, but because they realized they couldn't control people who weren't afraid of them anymore. That's the funny thing about bullies. Take away the fear, and they don't have much left to work with. Some of them left angry, muttering about the good old days, when things were neat, quiet, and rigid. Others left quietly, not ready to admit they'd been wrong, but smart enough to know their time was over. I didn't hate them. Honestly, I felt sorry for them. They'd wasted years fighting to keep things exactly the same, while the rest of us were out here figuring out how to make things better. That was the legacy I never expected to leave behind. Not a war, not a legal victory, but a shift in how people saw themselves. Once you help someone see that they deserve a voice, they don't give it up again. And the funny part? The cabin stayed. We fixed it up, cleaned it, made it safer, even added a few touches that made it more useful for the community. Raised garden beds, a workshop for neighborhood projects, a lending library built out of recycled windows. It stopped being the crazy guy's shack, and became a symbol of what could happen when people stopped apologizing for existing. And the most beautiful thing about it? Diversity wasn't something we had to chase anymore. It was already here. People from every kind of background, with every kind of story, were part of this place. We didn't have to run campaigns about inclusion. We just had to stop pushing people out. Turns out, when you stop trying to sanitize your community for appearances, you get something far better than matching fences. You get life. You get color. You get energy. You get stories that don't all sound the same. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was easy. It wasn't. Leadership rarely is. The temptation to lash out, to punish, to become exactly like the people we were fighting against was always there. That's why I kept reminding myself, and everyone else, that the point wasn't revenge. It was transformation. You don't build a future by burning everything down and sitting in the ashes. You build it by planting things, nurturing them, watching them grow, and trusting that even when you don't see immediate results, change is happening under the surface. Forgiveness was part of that too. Not because everyone deserved it, but because we deserved to move forward. Carrying old battles like trophies doesn't help build schools, fix sidewalks, or create safe places for kids to play. That's where real leadership showed itself. Not just in speeches or clever tactics, but in choices made when no one was watching. Choosing to mentor instead of mock. Choosing to include instead of exclude. Choosing to build when tearing down would have felt so much easier. And the truth? Growth doesn't always look like success at first. Sometimes it looks like disagreement. Sometimes it looks like arguments that go nowhere for a while. Sometimes it looks like mistakes, frustration, even failure. But real growth isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. And that's what we gave each other. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to try anyway. Permission to keep going even when it felt like nothing was changing fast enough. By the end, the transformation wasn't just in bylaws or buildings. It was in people. People who believed they had the right to speak, the right to care, the right to create something that didn't exist before. That's how you change culture, not by handing out pamphlets but by handing out responsibility. And once people accept that responsibility, they don't stop. They teach others. They grow. They inspire the next ones. That's what happened here. And that's what could happen anywhere else, too. Not because of me, but because of all of us. Because once you light that fire of change, it doesn't burn out. It spreads. Quietly. Relentlessly. Beautifully. And the best part? It doesn't need permission. It only needs people willing to start.